From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on CAN TV for some conversation around the little table, and I'm so glad that you have joined us again for another week. On the program today, neighborhood high schools, those big hulking buildings that can serve up to 2,000 kids in some cases. There are many of them dotted all over Chicago, but in some parts of Chicago, notably the south and west sides, they're down to as much as 15-20% capacity. They're almost completely empty. Today we're gonna look at the question of, have we given up? Have we just said they're not worth it? They're not worth saving, they're not worth putting investment into. The kids who are there are the kids, let's face it, that we care the least about, from families that we seem to care the least about. And maybe where we're headed on all this is we're just gonna shut them down. And that would probably be a catastrophe, but who knows? Maybe that's what the community wants. Joining us today is Kate Grossman. It is so good to have you back at the table, Kate. Thanks for being back. Now, the last time we talked to you, you were deputy editorial page editor over at the Sun-Times. Now you're safely ensconced in academia at the University of Chicago.
That's right.
So tell us what you do at the U of C.
So I'm a director at the Institute of Politics, which is not really academia, to be fair.
Right. It's politics, after all.
It's politics.
But then isn't academia politics?
Yeah, that's true. But it's outward-facing politics, which I prefer.
Because that internal-facing politics is the worst.
Yeah. So the Institute of Politics was started in 2013 after David Axelrod left the White House with the goal of engaging young people and the public in constructive dialogue about public policy and politics, and to encourage young people to go into public service. So I run a fellowship program there for journalists and policymakers, and
Excellent.
And on the side, I'm still writing.
I can see that, yeah. And a big shout out to our friend Steve Edwards, who kind of runs that place and has been on the show here many times before. So, yes, you're not in the rough and tumble of day-to-day journalism, but you are still, thank goodness, doing some very good journalism. And I really want to congratulate you on your piece in The Atlantic. I think it's a very well thought out piece, and it's just filled with statistics. I often like to start the conversation by quoting people back to themselves. And you said I have to say, the first 3-4 paragraphs of this story just kind of grab you by the throat, and you just have to say, all right, I'm going to clear out the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes, whatever it is. I got to sit and read this because it is such a focus on what is wrong with us today in our society. Chicago's neediest students are clustered at the bottom of the pecking order of the district in the most under-resourced and embattled schools. That says it right there, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you. This is an issue that I covered education for 15 years, both as a reporter and then as an editorial writer. And this issue of sort of the abandonment of neighborhood schools, and more importantly, the kids who end up there, who don't have other choices, has been sort of a theme in all my reporting. And I finally had a chance to kind of step back and really look at the big picture and see what we've done over the last 15 years in Chicago, as choice has proliferated in the city, and we've opened, I think the number of high schools has increased by 63%.
That's amazing.
Since 2000, and the student population is essentially flat. So,
Can I quote the numbers back to you? Because I wrote them down. There are 101,000, and there's going to be a lot of numbers on this show, folks, but just bear with us here. 101,000 students right now in 140 high schools in Chicago. And in 2000, it was 93,000 students in 86 schools. So the schools went from 86 to 140, and the population is fairly level, 93,000 up to 101.
Right. So so what's happened is that the school system, understandably, around 2000, a lot of people were abandoning neighborhood schools, as we're seeing now, and the school system wanted to do something about it. They wanted to give kids better opportunities, which no one can argue with that. But what they did, unfortunately, is sort of typical Chicago public schools, it was done in such a haphazard way without thinking of the demographics, planning ahead, thinking if we put this charter school 2 blocks from this neighborhood school, what's the impact going to be? And this idea, I think, that's pretty bankrupt that competition from another school will improve achievement at the neighborhood high school. It doesn't work, basically. I mean, sometimes it does get people more motivated because you have to go out and fight for your kids. But if you don't have the resources to fight, and you're a neighborhood school, which means that you have an attendance boundary, and any kid who's in that attendance boundary can come to your school.
And all the kids in that attendance boundary are below the poverty line, substandard in their academic achievement in elementary schools.
Right. So it's not a fair competition.
Yeah, that would be a good way of putting it. Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with choice. In fact, in all the reporting for this article, I mean, across the board, from kids in schools who don't get to choose to kids who get into the select enrollment, everybody wants to make a choice. Of course, it makes sense. But you can't just throw it to the wolves and expect and not plan for this inevitable consequence, which is that there are always going to be kids, the most vulnerable kids at the bottom, and you have to plan for that so they don't get screwed, basically.
Yeah.
And CPS has never done well by those kids, but I argue in the piece that this is a new low.
Yeah. I got to tell you that when I finished reading this piece, the feeling I had was really rage. I mean, I felt real, genuine anger about this. And it's not just anger about what they're doing to these grand old schools. It's exactly what you're talking about. It's this haphazard, bump up against the walls kind of solve today's problem because we don't have the money to solve tomorrow's problem thinking that's been going on. And also, it's tied hand in hand with this kind of, I don't know, almost like Hunger Games, Ayn Rand sort of every man for themselves, survival of the fittest. We're gonna build beautiful palaces for the kids that we like, the kids who are just striven to succeed, and we'll build some okay places for the rest, and then that bottom echelon, screw them, doesn't matter.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
I can't.
Yeah.
That's the response I get to this.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that was the master plan.
No, that was not. That would not be a master plan.
Right, and
no.
even people say it is, that this was the goal all along of choice, was to put these schools in a death spiral so that they'd eventually have to close. And there are some schools that should close.
Sure.
There's no question that kids would be better off elsewhere. But the rage part, I think, is just the foresight, the lack of appreciating what these policies are going to do, and thinking about what we need to do today, and not appreciating that you're always going to have this bottom population, and it's our obligation as a society to do well for them too, right. To do better for them.
And of course, to be fair to CPS, they're in an impossible situation too, because we as a country decided some time ago that we're going to shrink the resources, because after all, we all know government is the enemy, and government is the problem, and we all pay too much tax, and so therefore we're going to shrink the tax base as much as we possibly can, and then we're going to cut funding to schools, especially urban schools, cut. And I wouldn't, as much as I criticize them, I wouldn't want to be one of those board members who's sitting there with whatever it is, 11% less money than you had last year and 30% more money than you had 5 years ago. You have to do something. And so what they do is they try to do the best they can for the kids who are the best achievers and just let the chips fall where they may. To some extent, their hands are tied. I have to concede that.
Right. I mean, I agree. They're working under very difficult circumstances, but I also think that the Board of Ed does a lot of things that have negative consequences for these schools that they can avoid. So for example, the way that kids, 8th graders, choose where they're going to go to high school, the way the system is set up disadvantages neighborhood schools. It kind of and they're already labeled like for the leftovers, and everything in the application and what the 8th grade counselors do, it all reinforces this idea. They don't do anything proactively to try to encourage people to embrace their neighborhood schools. And the other big part is that, 3 years ago, the Chicago Public Schools switched to a per pupil budgeting system. And again,
a very, very important thing. Don't let that just slip by. That was a major philosophical and political change, and it has had, and we're just now beginning to see the impact of it, I believe.
And so basically the idea is the money follows the kids. So if you don't go to your neighborhood school, your dollars, your $6,000 or whatever it is, follows you to a neighborhood school outside your neighborhood, or a charter school, or a test-based school. And so that there was some degree of that before 2013. Of course, your budget declined when your enrollment declined, but it was not nearly as dramatic. And so, and CPS kind of tried to prop up the low enrollment schools for a little while by holding them harmless and not having them feel the full weight of the loss of that $6,000 or whatever it is per kid. But starting the last year or two, because they're broke, they're like, sorry,
that deal doesn't hold anymore.
That doesn't hold anymore. And again, these are kids who need the most. They have extremely high special ed rates. In the story, I took the 10 lowest enrollment schools, and I did all their averages for the ACT scores and their mobility rates. I mean, the average was 57% mobility rates. That's like in a given year.
Unbelievable.
Coming and going. The special ed rate, I think it was 25%. The average, the citywide average is more like 16%.
So almost double.
Right, and some of them, like Tilden High School, has almost 40% special ed. So the bottom line is these kids need more, extra beyond. So my point is, I get it. CPS is in a tough position, and it's easy to throw stones from the outside, and but they've made a lot of decisions.
Well, that's as far as I'm willing to go, as I said, to be fair. But now, getting back to what I really think, the people who are on the Board of Education are some of the most well-resourced people with the best political connections in our city. They are some of the most influential people in our city. But I don't see them standing up and saying and demanding, you are going to give us more resources. They really argue like, well, this is what we've got. We got to do it.
But to be fair to them, in Illinois, school funding is primarily by property taxes. So that's a system we have statewide. And so that's why Chicago and other relatively poorer districts don't get as much as the wealthy districts. Right. And so the state only contributes like 25% of the total amount we spend on education. Most states it's more like 50%.
And aren't we now number 50? Didn't we drop from 49 to 50 in
it doesn't matter, I don't know, probably.
I think we're like the worst state. Congratulations, all of us, Illinois. We're like the state that funds education the least.
Right. So, I mean, I agree. The Board of Ed is a resource-rich group of people, but until the state changes the way we fund education, and to be frank, until people in the city of Chicago are willing to pay more for their school to have good schools, the way people do in the suburbs, the Board of Ed is only going to, their pie is this big, and so they have to divvy it up. Yeah. And that's really at the heart of the matter of the resource question.
Yeah. I have to go back for a minute to this student-based budgeting, because this is something we've just been nattering on about forever on this program. But it's one of those insidious programs that looks so eminently fair on paper, right? Why wouldn't we be in favor of giving every kid exactly the same amount of money and letting that money follow them from school to school? Well, I'll tell you why. Because some kids cost more to educate than others do.
Right. Well, so the student-based budgeting is so that's the base amount, but schools do get more on top of that based on their percentage of special education students and English language learners and poverty and all that. So there is some extra money built in. But the problem is that the theory works fine. It's just that, first of all, the base amounts are too low, and then it doesn't factor in that we're not selling widgets here. We can't just shut this school down midstream because they're not competing.
Well, I mean, what really galls me about this is the city doesn't do this in other ways. The city doesn't say every firehouse in the city is going to have the exact same number of firefighters and paramedics and the budget is going to be exactly the same. We don't say the same thing about our libraries or our ward offices or anything else. These things are determined by the needs of the population and the services that they provide.
Yeah.
And schools that have high levels of service provision just have a whole different budget structure. So it's simplistic to the extreme to believe that you can do this one-size-fits-all notion, and it's dangerous to our society. It's dangerous to our culture.
Right, I agree. And also a lot of these schools suffer from two of the ones that I talk about in the story, besides Austin High School, are Tilden and Wells High School. And they both had these big federal turnaround grants. You know, Tilden had a $6 million grant over 3 years, was fantastic. They got to hire all these extra social workers and case managers, because a lot of kids just have tremendous social problems, social and emotional problems. And then the money, then it expires.
Right.
And that's part of it. And you know, it's great to have it for the time, and they're supposed to build capacity so they're ready for when the grant expires. But capacity with what?
With what? Where is it going to? Right. I mean, it's almost a negative thing in the end to have that money. I was reminded when I was reading that of the much maligned Chicagoland series on CNN with Fenger High School, Liz, I can't think of, I forgot her name.
Dozier.
Liz Dozier. And they were going through that exact same thing. They
had
had a
the same
little
grant.
spurt because they had this grant and they knew that the money was ending, and then it ends and things just begin to fall apart again. Right. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, definitely money is a huge part of it, but the other piece is, when I was out interviewing for this story and I was trying to figure out why enrollment was declining so much at Austin High School, at Phillips High School, or maybe not Phillips, at Robeson, a bunch of high schools, all in the south and west sides, all in predominantly black, poor neighborhoods. And definitely choice was a big factor, but there was also perception of violence was a huge factor. And it was so stunning about Austin because I went back there 4 or 5 times. It's pretty calm school. I didn't see any fights when I was there. If you look at their misconduct numbers, certainly higher than you might like, but not through the roof. But because the Austin neighborhood is a more violent neighborhood, that of course rubs off on the school. And
why would you want to send your kids to Austin?
Why would you want to
Right. And so not high school, but into Austin.
Right, into Austin. Even if you live in the neighborhood, you want to get out of the neighborhood to go to school. And so that sort of tarnishes the school itself, no matter how great the things are that are going inside the building. And that's a big, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I heard that repeatedly, and I really want to stress that it's not just, it factors into choice, of course, because if you have a choice, people are making it to leave, but it's this perception of violence and the reality of violence in these neighborhoods that really hurt these schools.
And that's something that really has to be factored into this equation too, because you could make an argument that, well, what if we gave Austin High School $20 million and built a whole bunch of new labs and, really spiffed it up and made it a great place? We're able to increase the faculty, improve the academic environment. Would people want to go to it just because of where it is?
Right. Well, and because Austin was a neighborhood high school until I think it was 2004, and then it was shuttered because of poor performance and because it was so chaotic. And it reopened as 3 small schools within the building, and they were pretty good schools. They didn't have high scores, but one in particular, Polytech, has this manufacturing program. They have this advanced manufacturing lab where they have partnerships with real companies, and they worked with manufacturing companies to set it up. Kids can graduate with certificates. They can do, find internships and jobs. So there was actually quite a bit invested in that school. And when I was there at an open house with kids and with their parents, they were like, oh, wow, I didn't know this was going on in here. So I don't mean to be more depressing, but even sometimes when there are positives in the building to attract, they've just had this huge drop off in enrollment in these 3 schools in Austin. And I think a lot of it is because there's this perception that the school itself is a violent place when it really isn't.
Well, I mean, this is just heartbreaking. You talk about the counselor who's trying to market the school, and
she called all 30 different elementary schools in the general area to try to get them, because they hold the key, the 8th grade counselors, in terms of getting kids to think about where they're going to go for high school. And she only got 2 of them who'd even call her back.
That's amazing.
Yeah. It's tough. And it was cool to see, actually, when one of them, I was there for one of the open houses when one of those schools brought their 8th graders, about 50 8th graders. And they put on a great show, Austin did, and I could tell the kids were impressed. They're like, oh, I didn't know anything about this. They either didn't know anything about Austin, or they only knew bad things.
Only knew bad stuff, yeah.
And they're like, oh.
Yeah. Well, how this ties into my own experience as a lifelong Chicagoan is that we had George Schmidt on the program a while ago. He was actually 2 years ago, talking about this very topic. And I was telling him that, I went to Stowe Elementary, not a stellar school. I mean, I'm not sure if it was even in the middle of the pack, but, one of those kind of schools. And my neighborhood school was Kelvin Park. And I was counseled by the counselor at Stowe that he thought that maybe I was smart enough that I could get into Lane and that I should definitely not go to Kelvin Park. Well, I knew more than the counselor did. I knew that I wasn't as smart as maybe he thought I was, and I knew that I would not make it at Lane. But the other option was to go to Prosser, which I did, because it was my kind of school. It was a mid-pack kind of school where I could learn trades and be much happier, because I never wanted to be a lawyer or a doctor or anything like that. So I had that freedom of choice even in 63. And even in 1963, the counselor was telling me, don't go to the neighborhood school. It's just not very good. So this has been going on for generations. It's not a new thing.
Right. But the issue is, and that's the counselor's job, right? She's looking at Ken and saying, what's best for you, right? And so I'm not going to begrudge anyone that opportunity to do best for themselves, for their kid. Everybody should do what's best for their kid, but there have to be systems in place to kind of look at the big picture.
Right.
And that's where the condemnation lies. And that's hard. Great. Life goes on. There's 500 and something odd schools in Chicago, and it's very hard to get a handle on it. But somebody has to be minding the big picture.
Well, it really does. I've been thinking about this almost constantly since I read your article, trying to figure out, well, where do I stand on this? I mean, as I said, I exercised choice, 40 years ago. It seems to me, though, that maybe the time has come. Maybe these old line huge schools for 2,000 kids, maybe their day is past. Maybe we really do have to get past them, and maybe we should do at the, forgive the term, lower echelons, what we've done at the higher echelons, and that is build really excellent schools for, frankly, lower performing kids, and have many, but not as many as we have. Maybe we could repurpose some of the old buildings and have it that way, and just get away from the concept of a neighborhood school. Because as you say, if you're in a great neighborhood already, well, you want to go to the school that's in your neighborhood. If you're not in a great neighborhood, you want to go into a better neighborhood for your school. So maybe that's what we have to do.
I mean, I
don't know
think
how
that's
that
certainly
works.
worth considering, because kids at the bottom need more, and we have to acknowledge that. The problem is, though, that neighborhood schools aren't just for the kids; they're for the neighborhood.
Exactly.
These are struggling neighborhoods that don't have a lot of anchors, and you take the school away, and you can't attract the businesses, you can't attract homeowners. There's no sense of community. When I looked
There's just fewer people
there's
around.
fewer people. So that's a pretty powerful argument for investing in the neighborhood schools, because all the ripple effects. And what you see, like in Austin and many other neighborhoods like it, is they only had 14% of the 8th graders in the attendance boundary going to
14%.
Either the Austin building or Douglas High School, which was the other neighborhood high school. And the rest are just scattering. I mean, they went to 90 different high schools.
That's amazing.
And what kind of community is that, right? You don't get to know each other. You're not doing activities together, or even just, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like utopia or anything,
Right,
but I
right.
mean, that really strains or doesn't allow for the growth of community, which allows for businesses to grow and walkability and all that stuff that everybody, and safety that everybody wants.
So have we gone too far? Are we too far down that road? Is it possible to fix a Hirsch, a Wells, a Tilden? I mean, can they be made into attractive schools? Even if you had unlimited amounts of money, could you do it?
I don't know. It's a tough one.
See, that's my problem too.
Right.
I don't know if I mean, I think it's not my sense that these schools died a natural death. They were murdered.
Right. That's the point.
They were jumped in the alley.
Right.
But the question is, can they, or do we even want to revive them at this point?
Right. I mean, maybe not all of them, but I think you need to revive some of them, and maybe you have sort of regional high schools. Although there's always this issue of kids having to cross gang lines, and that's a really serious issue. But given the limited resources, maybe it makes sense to, because like this group Generation All came out with a report on Wednesday, and their whole goal is to kind of reclaim and grow neighborhood high schools for all the reasons I just articulated.
That's an interesting topic right there in itself. It also brings to mind another conversation that we've had here about large versus small schools. You said that Austin broke up into 3 small schools. They're giving up on that. They're trying to go back to being a neighborhood school again. Seems to me that kids in the suburbs, where there's only one school very often, and it is a huge school with 4,000 kids in it, there are advantages and disadvantages, but boy, I think there are a lot of advantages. I mean, things like you can have a really great basketball team, something, or debate team, or whatever it is. You can't have that when there are 75 kids in a high school.
Sure, and that's, a lot of kids, it's sort of this vicious cycle. The schools start declining enrollment, and then kids don't want to go because they want to play football, they want to play basketball, or they want to be on this club or that club, and so then you can't get any traction. I would argue, though, I mean, there's below a certain point is too small. And in fact, the 3 schools at Austin have essentially been operating as one school for, all the after-school stuff.
Yeah.
But they're very intimate, and the adults really know the kids in those buildings. And I mean, that's great for every kid, but particularly for kids who bring a lot of trouble into the building, it's really powerful. I mean, I was really impressed when I walked around the building, and I didn't feel like it was a show just because a reporter was there. The adults, they really know those kids, and they care about them, they know their names. Kids like in the hallway not supposed to be, and the woman who was showing me around one of the times just knew just what to say to get him back into class, because there weren't like a sea of kids. It was just this one kid in the hallway, and
hard
so,
to ignore.
right? And so, and she wasn't all flustered because there weren't so many kids to deal with. She just really gracefully dealt with this one kid and kind of ushered him back into class. And so, I mean,
maybe that's the way to handle the schools that are, I mean, I don't know, maybe we have schools that specialize in kids who have, low achievement and low family involvement and all that. Maybe those need to be smaller. I don't know.
Right, and there are, this wasn't included in my grand total of number of schools that CPS has, but over the last several years, CPS has been opening a lot of alternative high schools for kids who were either at risk of dropping out or have already dropped out and trying to re-enroll, and they tend to be very small, which I think makes a lot of sense. But maybe that kind of model needs to be spread more broadly for this population of kids.
Yeah. You had mentioned the report that came out today, Generation All, I think it is, and I know that Catalyst has a story as we're speaking today, just came out this morning, about a couple of action plans. There's actually, apparently CPS has its own internal working group trying to come up with some solutions to these problems. Have they come up with any, I mean, does Generation All actually have a proposal for how to fix this, or are they just cataloging all the problems?
No, I mean, so Generation All is a partnership through the Chicago Community Trust that was started about a year and a half ago, specifically to deal on this issue of declining enrollment in neighborhood high schools. What do we do about them? and it's in partnership with the teachers union and CPS. And they have a couple of concrete recommendations. Their main focus is basically strengthening the neighborhood schools, like reclaiming them, and not just CPS. They want like everybody in the community, families, teachers, everybody to prioritize and try to invest in your neighborhood at high schools and elementary schools, but particularly high schools. But they have a couple of concrete recommendations, which is stop opening new schools.
Yeah.
Until there's like clarity about what's the master plan
That seems
here.
to be the one, excuse me for interrupting, that just seems to be the one thing that seems to be pretty no-brainer. Stop opening more schools.
Right. And and CPS has slowed the opening of charters. They're actually a little bit in a jam on this because state law requires them to put out an RFP every year to solicit charter applications, whether CPS wants them or not. And so even, they're not going to open 10, maybe they're only going to open 3, but they're in a jam there. So but there's a solution to that. It's dealing with the state legislation, figuring out how to. So
you don't have a charter commission that reverses CPS when CPS says it wants to close 3 schools and they say, no, you're going to keep them open.
Right, but I mean, just from a number standpoint, it makes no sense to be opening any new schools when you can't fill the schools that you already have.
Do you think, I've always heard the grand conspiracy theorists saying that really all this is just a way of just killing these schools off so the charters can take the buildings over.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
I see that from your article.
Yeah, I mean,
and
maybe
by the way, thanks for sort of clearing some of that up, because I have to say that you kind of like dealt head on with some of my prejudices and made me think, okay. Yeah.
Well, for all these years covering CPS and covering public institutions, this is sort of a pathetic conclusion, but where people often see conspiracies, I just see like incompetence. Basically, it's people doing a mediocre or often way worse than mediocre job, and so there's all these,
Area 54 or whatever it is. That's just all incompetence too.
I'm not saying there aren't some like master plans, but often it's just like nobody thinks ahead, nobody plans, nobody executes well, and there are all these negative consequences.
And nobody stays in power for more than a couple of years.
And I'm not saying that the governor doesn't want like this whole Chicago Public Schools to be charters. There are people who certainly want that, but I don't think that was the master plan.
Well, one of the things that I have to say kind of like whacked me in the head was when you pointed out that of the 87 district-run high schools, 19 are over capacity of the 87. But then, of course, what we're dealing with is the 35 that are under half full. 50 of them are considered under-enrolled, and those are the ones that have the high suspensions and low ACTs and everything. But the thing about the Austin district, which you studied, is that the kids, as you say, went to 90 schools, but beyond that, a third of them went to other neighborhood schools.
Right.
And about a third of those also made it into selective enrollment CPS schools, and about a third went to charters. See, if you had asked me 2 days ago, I would have said, probably about 85% of them ended up in charters.
Right.
Well, it's not. It's not true.
And that's something
sometimes
I really...
the facts really just mess things up. Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
right?
And that's something I really wanted to look at, because that was... I know lots of people think what you think, and I didn't think that was true, just based on what I've seen. And so I was glad to clarify that. First of all, there's not as many charters as people. There's a lot of charters, but 85 couldn't go to charter schools because there's not enough charter schools. But the point is, this is choice writ large, this issue. It's kids choosing a selective school, like you said, other neighborhood schools. That was, I think, the highest percentage of where they wanted to go to Prosser. They wanted to go to North Grand.
That was a real surprise to me.
They wanted to go to a neighbor school that was perceived as higher achieving was higher achieving and safer.
And they don't mind the bus ride or whatever
Well,
it is.
they do mind.
They do
mind the bus ride.
But it's a better choice.
Yeah, and so so that's, I think, a really important point about this, and why things have gotten so nuts in this city, with people just going a gazillion different directions. And there is a real logic to say if we just would embrace the school in your neighborhood, we could solve all the travel and all the business, and that's obviously much harder to do than to say.
Yeah.
But
not to mention strengthening the neighborhood long term.
Right. So it's this choice system that we've set up, and that's one of the recommendations this Generation All group is to try to change the application system and CPS. I don't know if this would solve it. It would help it a little bit, but to make it so that there's one application for all schools, whether you're applying to a charter, because a lot of people can't make a choice because they can't figure out the system. But also, you would choose a neighborhood school. Everyone would affirmatively make a choice, which could help, I think, on the margins. I don't think that's the solution, but it would be helpful.
Have we gone beyond the point where there will ever again be schools where there are kids of all different levels of achievement all in the same school? I mean, it sounds like that's a choice that we made. Linda Lutton obviously did a beautiful piece a couple of years ago called The Big Sort, where she just absolutely proved with numbers that, I don't know, I hate using terms like smart kids. I can't stand that kind of term, but those kids, we all know who they are, higher achievement, higher family involvement, those kids, better resource kids. They have all just migrated to, Northside Prep and Walter Payton, and that's where they all are.
Right.
So, is that good for the city? Is it good for us that there are 3 or 4 or 5 schools where all of those kids are concentrated in one place? That's probably not any better for us than the fact that we've got all of the under-resourced kids concentrated in 10 or 15 schools.
No, I mean, it's not ideal by any stretch. And I have to say, this movement to try to embrace neighborhood schools has not taken off in neighborhoods like Austin, but actually it is taking off in more established, more affluent neighborhoods, and also often in Latino neighborhoods because of this. It's nuts, right? You can't, not every kid can get into Northside and Payton, and it's the stress that the kids are faced with when they're 12 is really intense.
It's actually a crime against humanity, I think, in a lot of ways. I mean, I know so many people who've gone through that in their families where it's just like there comes this moment when your kid is 12, 11, whatever it is, and the real decision you have to make is, well, I guess it's time to leave Chicago, right? We got to move somewhere, or we're gonna gird for this 3 or 4 year fight to get you into one of these 10 schools.
What they're, so they're in the 47th ward, which includes Lakeview High School and Amundsen, which is also, I think, the 40th ward. But anyway, the aldermen there and a lot of folks in the community have said, this is nuts. Like, we have 2 good high schools
Perfectly
here.
Good schools.
Let's take them. Let's embrace, not take them, but let's embrace them.
Good, solid schools built decades ago that are still standing and still worth investing in.
And they've had some nice success because there's a need for it, because not everyone can get into a selective enrollment school and would prosper there even if they got in.
That's an important point, Kate. I'm sorry, I keep interrupting. I can't control myself here. It's not just that not everybody can get into one of these schools. Not everybody wants to. I mean, I can honestly tell you, when I was that age, I would not have. You couldn't have at gunpoint got me into, Walter Payton, even if I had the grades.
Yeah.
Because I just knew that I would be very unhappy in that dog-eat-dog environment where every minute of the day you've got to think about the 4 hours of homework you've got to do, and will I be able to beat him at the...
Yeah.
I'm not that kind of guy, and many people are not.
Right. So schools like Lakeview and Amundsen and Washington High School, and there's some others, there's this movement to try to embrace them again. And so there you're going to have more of the normal cross-section of high-achieving kids, middle kids, some lower kids. So then you probably still have tracking within the school, which is what people are more familiar with. Now we have tracking between schools, So,
and they don't have to. Then that way the kids don't have to deal with each other in the halls. They're in a different.
Well, they do have PE together and art.
No, I'm
and stuff,
saying when they're separated by schools, they don't have to worry about it. They never have to.
So it is encouraging to see the embracing of neighborhood schools in some neighborhoods is starting to take off.
That's interesting. It really is. And also, just a side note, that you also point out that the black population, obviously, in Chicago has dropped precipitously, but the number of kids in given neighborhoods of high school age kids has not necessarily dropped.
No, it hasn't. Though in Austin, it
has there.
But some of the other neighborhoods.
But this is more than just. It's so easy to dismiss this as, well, the problem is all the black people have left Chicago, so we got to close.
No, but
well,
that's
it's not
not
that.
it.
That's not what it is.
They're going to, like I said,
they're exercising choice.
Yeah, they went to 90 different
Right.
schools.
Man, are they exercising choice.
Yeah.
So one last thing I think is important, to, again, on the day we're recording this, the special commission that Mayor Emanuel put together to look at the police department has dropped their report, and it is scathing. It is just unbelievable. And I was thinking that not since like the Kerner Commission have I seen a group of people put together to go out and look at something like police community relations and come back with something this frank. And I'm just wondering what you think about that as a former editorialist. I know you must have been interested in it.
Yeah.
How does it fit in with this conversation we're having today?
Well, I think it fits in a bunch of different ways. So it was very direct about sort of long-term racism, and let's stare it in the face and let's not pretend anymore, which is sort of similar to this neighborhood school thing, that everybody's known about this problem, and it's now gotten so acute as the police misconduct issue has gotten so acute that it's just like, let's just rip the Band-Aid off and talk about this horrible wound so we can somehow figure out a way to heal, which I think is excruciatingly painful for the city, but so necessary. So that's one piece. And then the other is that, again, they're both examples of sort of policies, negative consequences of policies, right? So Chicago has a big crime problem, right? So we go after the criminals hard and aggressively and often in ways that are racist and unfair. But we want crime down, right? So we've looked the other way for a long time, and now we're staring in the face of the fact that we've treated people in horrible ways in the name of safety, right? Same thing with the schools. We want choice. We want people to have the opportunity to go to the best school, the safest school they possibly can. Nothing wrong with that, and we all want that. But there's all these negative consequences of it, and that we're seeing in the neighborhood schools. So there's similarities between sort of this come to Jesus moment on both these policies that we've had in this city that have some real positives, but have backfired in a lot of ways and are kind of like destroying like the core of who we are as a city. So as painful as it is, I think I'm hopeful that we can be better, that we're better than this. That if we stare these things in the face and say, this is not the Chicago that I love or I want to be a part of, which I think is so great that they were honest in this police report, especially because it was appointed by the mayor and everyone thinks, it's going to be whitewash, but no.
I was at the, I think it was the third one at Sullivan High School. But speaking, by the way, of a neighborhood high school that's really putting resources, or not resources, but they're putting a lot of energy into making it a better school. But anyway, I was there when the BYP and others just took over and ended the meeting, screaming at the stage, "You're a bunch of puppets of the mayor. You're not to be believed. Nothing you say will mean anything." I mean, it was brutal, and I mean, I just find it kind of ironic that they were literally chased off the stage. And then they came out with this report, so it'll be interesting. And I'm always looking for that little moment of being able to say something nice about Mayor Rahm Emanuel. And I got to give him credit for this. He knew what he was doing, because those folks on that panel were not puppets. I don't care what anybody says. They are not people who were just going to sit there and just come up with some whitewashed report. You knew when you looked at those folks that they were going to come up with something, but they came up with something that even exceeded what I thought they would be.
And not only, I mean, I agree, they're quality people who weren't going to do whitewash, but the climate won't tolerate that.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
it's
exactly.
the mood has changed.
Yeah.
There's no appetite at all. I mean, they would have been burned at the stake if they had come out with a report
Right.
that was whitewash. Not that that was their intent, but it's, you know, like I said, it's sort of a come to Jesus moment for
Yeah,
this city,
yeah.
and everyone's
Yeah.
ready to be honest.
And we have a new police chief, and we'll see if he's going to embrace this. And one can only believe that, again, falling into my conspiracy theory that everything is connected to everything, and there's always something going on. I think it's just really kind of interesting that this whole conversation was going on at the same time about who to choose for the police superintendent. And Mayor Emanuel had to know that he was getting this report coming in and that it was not going to be easy to read. So there had to be some connection to who he chose for police superintendent. I have a hard time believing that he chose somebody who's going to just close the book on it, put it on a shelf, and pretend it never happened. I mean, maybe that's just ridiculous naivete on my part, but it seems to me like maybe we're in for a little bit of change.
I think so. I mean, the underlying problems are incredibly hard. You know, it's about poverty and unemployment and lack of opportunities, and you know, that's where the crime comes from. So, because all this is a response to crime, a horrible response, a great response, but it's all a response to crime.
Well, I heard on the way into the taping this morning, I heard Lori Lightfoot on the radio, and she was making some very good points, not the least of which was that, you know, we have reached this point in our culture, in our society, where we have turned over to the police the people with whom we just simply, or about whom we just don't know how to deal with.
Right. Well, you look at, I mean, Laquan McDonald. I mean, this is a kid in foster care, in and out of school, just tons of problems.
Right. But a kid who was trying to turn himself around, but didn't have the resources to do that. And then what happens is they come, and this sounds like it's an apology for the police department for that, and it is not. It is not in any way. But the police department is asked to deal with the people that we as a society don't want to deal with.
Right.
And so it's kind of that Jack Nicholson moment, right? It's like, well, you know, you want me to fix this for you?
Right, well, we handed it over.
It's a very, very delicate conversation to have, and we're all in it. We're all a part of it. We all have played a role in getting us where we are now, and getting us out of it is going to be tough. But it's interesting to me that the police conversation and this schools conversation are literally two trains on the same track.
Yeah,
know?
I agree.
Well, thanks. I really
you.
enjoyed having you here today, and I wish you luck over at the U of C, and it's just great to see you in print. So.
Thanks.
All
Thanks
right.
for having me.
Kate Grossman is with the University of Chicago with the Institute of Politics, and we've known her here for a long time as the former editorial page deputy editor over at the Sun-Times, and she's writing for The Atlantic, and I hope other places too. Are you? Not yet?
One at a time.
One at a time, that's enough. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks very much for watching. We'll be back next week with another program, and in fact, I think we're going to pick this conversation up next week, so we'll do that then, and I hope you'll be there with us as we document our swirling down the drain as everything is awful, isn't it? No, we're very optimistic here at Chicago Newsroom, and thanks for watching. Be back again next week, and don't forget you can watch us anytime you want right here at this address. Thanks. Bye.